Let's see if I can tie these thoughts together coherently, because this is something that I've been working on for months, and I think I heard myself mentally say everything in a row, and I'm like, I fucking got it. Anyway, um, about a year ago, I personally started working on my codependency addiction and working to eradicate codependency from my language and my psychology and how I tend to interact with people. And and that's also, there's a lot of that tied to my CPTSD. Um, And again, CPTSD and autism very much amplify each other when they're both present. Anyway, something interesting that I realized about through my work with untangling my codependency was that there was a lot of master and slave dynamics in codependency. And I also, at the same time, kind of realized that there is so much of that codependency and master slave psychology in primarily the language of our social interactions, particularly in the metropolis that I'm in, and I'm in the States, Um, so like that really messed me up for a while once I got to the point of realizing how much codependency is in like our social structures and like our social like hierarchies especially, but then specifically how the hierarchies interact with each other. And I just kind of figured that tied in with this country specifically's past as far as, the slavery that we had here, after the genocide that we had here, and then slavery ended, but like not for the right reasons, right? Like, it's best that it happens. Period. Right? No slavery is better, right? But um, it wasn't to help out the slaves, really, when abolition happened. Um, it was to piss off one side of an army of Americans, between Americans. Anyway, and when slaves were freed, hush, I will feed you after this, but you must hush. Um, this wasn't a good moment for distractions. Anyway, codependency. Oh, I figured that what I was seeing in that slave master dichotomy psychology, I figured that was just still intact from our history here. What the hell is my vape? Um, and also, what's fascinating about that is fascinating specifically about our past here, and like there we go. I'm primarily Scottish Irish, as far as I know. Sure as fuck looks like it. Um, and so there's a lot of interesting dichotomies as far as the psychology between hierarchies when you're considering both gender and free versus slave, and I should say free versus enslaved. Um, and also rich versus poor, because there's always been a really steep disparity of affluence in this country, and that's not novel, right? But specifically here, a lot of people came over here or were brought over here as prisoners or in servitude to pay off a debt or to earn their freedom through their labor. And I have a lot of fucking suspicion that that's where, you know, my, white family in the past came from and why. But what's interesting when you get into like the Irish in the U.S. Throughout history, like lots of like demonization and racism, which is like that's such a weird idea for anyone my age in the U.S. to think of racism between white people. Got a sneaking suspicion will start coming back because I'm just like all the like steep left versus right bullshit. Um, but with the Irish, there were kind of two tracks to the psychology from what I can kind of gather. And one is, and this isn't exclusive to Irish, but I'm saying that Irish were definitely susceptible to these thought processes. Um, One, you can, be white supremacist basically, and but also, well, where am I going with this? Yes, okay, you can be a white supremacist and be on the side and bootlicking and everything to the people that you deem uh, more powerful and the people who are more affluent. Um, and you can kind of jump in with them and say that enslaved people deserve to be in slavery, um, or you can be the kind of white person who sees, hey, my bicep looks kind of okay. You can be the kind of white person who um, sees a flat horizon as far as like equality and everything in the reality of things, right? But sees the social hierarchies and the structures and all of the kind of injustices within that. So you have the people who have humility or play the game, basically. And also, when you get into, when you're thinking about men versus women, especially like during, antebellum times and everything, women were basically slaves too. They pretty much have been in this country until this last century. And it was only like 50 years ago that, freedom really was fully available to a woman, in that she could have her own bank account that she opened herself without permission from a man. Um, so within the perspective of women, or on the focal point of women, throughout the last, 200-300 years here, um, it works. The psychology of it is kind of similar to um, the slave who builds themselves or works to stay in a role of the best slave. And I've certainly seen that kind of mindset in families, in schools, at work, at jobs. But then women are kind of, adjacent to that in the psychology of it in ways because there's a lot of playing the system, but there's also a lot of new games because you're in a different dimension of it. And, there's the stuff, there's the power plays that you can get away with within your, what's available to you, right? But then you are still oppressed. You are still oppressed by all the men in your life. And so there's a lot of stuff that is very much still in our culture and intact or remnant from all that. And then another thing that I realized when I was focusing a lot more on decolonizing. And I've just really been focusing on dismantling a lot of shit in my head, and understanding, how much got built by influences that I benefit from sitting down with today's perspective, and reevaluating. So something that I realized, I think over the last few months, or a few months ago, and I'm hearing and seeing this echoed in like other people that, whose work I listen to and care about, but just kind of seeing how okay, sorry. It took me a long time to get to find where I should start with that point. I was thinking a lot about kind of the spiritual beliefs in indigenous Turtle Island culture, and it tends to it tends to be based in an animist place, animism. The world is awake, the world is alive. We are all here participating in the world together. And I always kind of knew, and everybody else always does kind of know, that, and if I say everyone else, please know I'm talking about white Americans. Scope. I've always kind of had an awareness that like there were a lot of like shared values, or kind of parallel values in indigenous cultures, whether you're talking about the Aboriginals in Australia, or indigenous folks in this country. There's a lot of animism. There's more of an equality. There were exceptions, yes, but defining features, salient features. And then I realized that, like, wait, why? Two questions came in as like, why does like this also vibe with like European paganism, or at least our current concept, my lifetime's concept of pagan Europeans, and then also the question of like, indigenous here and then colonized by whites, indigenous there and colonized by whites, indigenous there and colonized by whites. And then I was like, where did they come from in Europe? Because I'm not that big into deep history like that. But then I realized, like, in some senses and in some cases, and depending on where you're talking about, paganism was like the indigenous peoples that got colonized and got forced to assimilate in Europe. So what's the prevailing facet that ties it all together? It is colonizer Christianity. So master and slave, right? And codependency, right? And designing something that keeps somebody traumatized, gets someone traumatized and keeps them there, so that they're more willing, they're more pliant, they're less self-reliant, right? You're talking on a psychological level, and a material level, and an economic way, and in a very much like the psychology of the culture, of the prevailing culture. It's like, wow, that all matches. And something that I've said a lot before is that, Jesus was a cool dude. I really liked what he was about. American Christianity has nothing to do with that person. Like, these people, and unfortunately these are the people influencing the laws in my, secular country. I guess, I don't know if we're considered secular, but, the separation of church and state that's supposed to be there, but really only benefits churches because of tax breaks. I'm all over the place. This is what happens on holidays. I'm alone for like a week and driving a lot. And I get a lot of good thinking in. But anyway, I think this kind of all fell into a little bit closer of a framework that I can go linearly through. This was not very cohesive. I realized that. Hopefully it was interesting or helpful to somebody.